So let's talk about right now. Would you be doing stress tests of banking right now? Because let's say they were done a year ago or 6 months ago, at maximum a year ago. That's the most distant. Presumably, many banks were not tested recently. Would there be a public interest in doing stress tests of banking right now? Especially given that we know some things, there are some unknown unknowns that we didn't even know about or perhaps hadn't thought about 6 months or a year ago.
I mean, if you mean in response to the current
I do, yeah.
coronavirus, um, I think the stress test takes a very long time. The only problem is, the overall process, at least in terms of the Bank of England, is more than 6 months, I think. So it's a very staggered process, and this is a very new emergent situation. So I'm not sure logistically whether it would be much use. I think you're probably getting at more of the public-facing dimensions of running stress tests.
Yeah. Oh, I had no idea it took 6 months. No, I really
turnover period. I mean, I think part of that is strategic, but maybe we could talk about that later. So would there be any point running an emergency stress test right now? I think that's what you're getting at.
That's what I'm thinking, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's a very precarious situation. It's very hard. I think it would be very hard under the current situation for the central bank to be able to predict what the response to a stress test would be. The situation is of such high level of uncertainty. How do you know? Would it be a good idea to fail banks? Almost certainly not. Would it be a good idea to say all the banks are absolutely fine when we're facing an obvious crisis situation? Probably also not a good idea. Because it would seem implausible, and it would undermine the credibility of the procedure, I think, at this point, if they just said everything's going to be absolutely fine.
Yeah.
So I think they're in such a bind that they would be best advised not to actually do a stress test at all. At least not a public one. They're very capable of doing an entirely private one between themselves and the banks, but that's a little beyond what we're talking about, I suppose. They do have the capacity to run very quick stress tests.
They do? Okay, well that's good.
So I think there's a difference between an individual bank running a stress test using their software and their own procedures versus a public stress test as a public administrative procedure. So the public administrative procedure, like a lot of aspects of government, tends to be a little bit slower and not as nimble, partly because they have to check what's going on. There has to be a lot of layers of governance involved in it. So the banks will almost certainly be running stress tests of the current situation internally within their organization.
Okay. So the banks are running.
You'll never know what the results of those.
Okay, but they're running. Well, that gives me some reassurance. Yeah. I hear the term and saw maybe a little bit more last week than this week. Something is a stress test for. It's a stress test of the American public health system. It's a stress test of the relationship between experts and public officials. It's a stress test of, Donald Trump. It's a stress test of all these kinds of things. I'm wondering what your view is about that. I have some opinions, but I'm curious first what you must doubtless heard the term being used now. So what about that?
I think it's an interesting example of a broader phenomenon of where you have a colloquial term that circulates in society, but also takes on a very specific technical meaning in a particular policy domain. So, I mean, if we're talking substantively, is this current situation a stress test? I think that almost certainly is a good use of the term stress test in the colloquial sense. Yeah, I mean, it seems like a valid use of the term. There is a situation or a scenario that is currently unfolding that's putting unprecedented strains on our current system. It's putting to the test, our current governance models and aspects of our economic model, which haven't really been tested in this way previously. Yeah. So I think it's an interesting extension. It's kind of hard for me to think of it like this because I'm so much in this kind of narrow technical thinking about what a stress test is, but I can certainly see a sort of useful extension of the term to think more broadly about the concept.
Yeah, I guess I would probably disagree with that. Yeah, I can see that as an extension, and I see the difference between the colloquial and the technical. But I think it is actually important to make a distinction between a stress test and a test that is happening under stress. They're different, because the stress test is a simulation, and something being like put to the test is not at all a simulation. It is the real thing. And, you know, the US public health system, or, any kind of health delivery system, or even their decision-making processes, could have a stress test in which there is a simulation which would help decision makers, or even the general public as they're made known of these things, improve the situation or deal with the vulnerabilities in the system without it having actual consequences. But a test that's happening under stress is absolutely got consequences. And that's why I'm a little reluctant to just say, oh yeah, that's a good use of the term. But back to you.
I think these things are quite entangled, though. Something we've seen in the current coronavirus outbreak is the use of scenarios. We've been all hearing terms like flattening the curve. These are all projections and scenario analyses, right, which are now informing government policy, or hopefully they are informing it. We have some questions about that in the UK. So there is definitely an entanglement between the reality and the simulacra unfolding currently in this situation. And I think it can be analytically useful to obviously distinguish between the simulation and what's really happening. But when what's really happening is very much entangled with the simulations that are going on by public health officials and so forth, where you draw the line is not always easy.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. Many of the things that we're seeing are based on models. Let's go back. I want to get once more what you said that was so interesting, because one of the things that's happening as society is put to the test, as our constitutional system in the United States is really being stressed, it is put to the test now. Our electoral democracy, our being able to think about the relationship between the Bill of Rights in the United States, of privacy, of a right to assembly, and how we think about these in relationship to public health. All of these are being put to the test in a stressful situation, and that an aspect of that reality is stress testing, not just of banking, but of all kinds of models and simulations, which are not a separate reality, but I think you said it better even than I, somehow a part of the reality of the society that is being put to the test.